Because you've always taken such charge.
Llegó justo antes del aguacero.
You are listening
to the Border Chronicle.
Hello, and welcome to the Border Chronicle podcast, where we bring you news and analysis from the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. My name is Caroline Tracy, and I'm a reporter and editor at the Border Chronicle. And today I'm bringing you a conversation with John Washington, who is a journalist based in Tucson, Arizona, who has covered immigration and the border for both national and local publications. John has a new book coming out on July 21st called How to Close a Camp, Dispatches from the Fight Against Immigration Detention. He's also the author of two previous books. One is called The Possessed, about the history of asylum, and the other is called The Case for Open Borders. We spoke about the history of immigration detention in the United States and about the practical ways that communities can put pressure on the authorities so that camps either do not open or can be shut down. So here is our conversation. Thanks for joining us, as always. I thought maybe it would be good to start just for the readers of ours and listeners of ours, viewers of ours that aren't familiar with your work. I think some people will be, but not everyone. Could you talk a little bit about your background as a journalist and translator and whatever else you've done?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, first of all. Really admire the Border Chronicle. I am a staff writer for Lookout, which is an LGBTQ plus accountability news outlet based mostly around Phoenix. I live in Tucson and have been writing from Tucson for a long time. I got into journalism specifically around writing about the border and immigration politics because my family comes from abroad and had an immigration journey that was a huge part of my life growing up, and I sort of didn't understand how much things have changed in the past 50 years since my family first came across. My mother migrated from Romania when she was a teenager, and heard stories about migration all my life, and didn't realize how intensely those stories were still taking place, especially along the southern American border, border with Mexico, and was really surprised that I was kind of isolated from that. And also, when I first moved out to the Southwest, I lived in California and in Arizona on and off for the last now 16 years or more. I noticed a huge disparity between the way that the border was talked about and the reality on the border, and the way that people who were crossed by or were crossing the border were experiencing it in real time, and wanted to help bridge that gap of understanding and really try to lay out the truth around why people move, how they move, and then how they are sort of crushed underneath the border immigration enforcement regime. And so I've written a number of books. The first was about the long history of asylum and asylum policy, specifically in the US. The last book was about the case for open borders and what a world of free and open migration would look like. And I've also translated a number of books, a lot about Latin America or immigration-related issues from the Spanish to English, and have been a local reporter now for about 5 years, really focusing on Arizona politics, also immigration and border stuff, as always, and even local county city politics here in Tucson and Pima County.
Great, wonderful. Do you know what pathway your mom and her family came to the U.S. via, and whether it still exists?
It's really a long story, but it goes way back to the Prohibition era, where you see these forms of circular migration that are being shut down. But my grandmother was actually born in Baltimore, and she moved back to Romania when her family left when she was less than 1 year old, and didn't even know that she was American for a long time. And then when things started getting really bad in Romania, especially for my family, but along with many other people, just facing persecution from, effectively totalitarian Soviet regime. Um, she found out that she had a pathway back, but the rest of the family didn't. And that's because not only did they need a way to get into the United States, they need a way to get out of Romania. And so exit visas, which are not really so much a thing these days, were very much in that era. And they struggled for a long time to get exit visas. And years and years of effort, they finally got to Italy. And then from Italy, they were able to eventually get to the United States. So that is it in a very brief overview. But they had that lucky, happenstance of my grandma's birth in the United States.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean it's very interesting because there aren't that many pathways, and immediate family is one of the, most common. I remember doing interviews or sitting in on sort of intake interviews at organizations assisting deportees and returned migrants in Mexico, and one of the first questions they asked was, were any of your parents or grandparents born in the United States? Because there are a lot of cases where people have been living without papers and don't realize that they could, adjust their status and sort of claim their
Yeah,
citizenship.
yeah,
So yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, and exit visas, gosh, I mean, maybe like Turkmenistan or something
yeah,
still. I don't
right.
know what Russia's situation is nowadays, but I feel like, some of the post-Soviet countries maybe still have that kind
Maybe,
of
yeah.
regime, but I don't know.
I
Yeah.
mean, like North Korea,
Hmm.
yeah, there's very few left.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, jumping to today's era of immigration enforcement, you write early on in your new book, which I will hold up for the folks that are going to be watching this on YouTube. How to Close a Camp is John's new book. Um, you write that in the One Big Beautiful Bill, there is an allocation for ICE that is bigger than all but 15 of the world's militaries. And can you talk about what the agency is going to do with that money or is already doing with that money?
It's a bonanza. So, one of the challenges of writing this book, which is about immigration detention, is I started it last summer, so less than a year ago, but last August, and I have been chasing the leads and trying to stay on top of all of the changes, and they are coming at such breakneck pace that it's very difficult. We closed this book and sent it to the press just a couple months ago, and already so much has changed. So that 70 billion allocated to DHS for immigration enforcement last fall, specifically ICE actually, last summer, um, has already doubled. And so there was another allocation bill as of this taping just a couple of weeks ago, dishing out another 70 billion. And so the calculation from today through 2029 is about $250 billion. So $240 billion for the effort of mass deportation. And what that looks like is a few things. One, more agents, more Border Patrol agents, more ICE agents, more wall, more surveillance technology. The amount spent on surveillance is skyrocketing right now. I mean, absolutely ballooning in funding. Uh, Also, detention. That is the one of the most expensive pieces of this whole immigration enforcement regime, and is where, at least initially, when they started spending that 70 billion from last summer, that's where they were really putting all the money. So about 40 billion of that was specifically dedicated to immigration detention, rapidly expanding the detention footprint. And that has looked like buying up warehouses. That is what the agency has spent most of the money doing. And it has not gone well at all. A lot of communities have pushed back. And they're already talking about potentially selling back some of those warehouses. So most of these were paid way over market rate and often purchased without letting the local politicians or local jurisdictions know anything about what their plans were for these detention spaces. And we've seen this happen in Arizona, in Surprise, Arizona. This is one of the big fights right now, is where they bought this warehouse, which is about 100 yards from a community. I went and knocked on doors in a neighborhood that was truly a stone's throw. I mean, maybe if you had a strong arm, you could actually throw like a baseball from a house or rooftop to where the detention center would be. Maybe that's barely a stretch. And they bought this with sight unseen without letting the local politicians know. And now they're facing all this pushback. And communities really trying to convince local politicians to take a stand, which they haven't so much. I mean, a couple have come out against it. A couple have asked ICE and DHS for more information, but they haven't said we don't. They haven't clearly stated the publicly elected officials, or sorry, the elected public officials haven't clearly stated we don't want this here. The community is so outraged that they've actually started a petition to disband the community, to unincorporate the town of Surprise, and hoping that that in some way could allow them to get involved and like throw more sand in the gears and try to slow this down or ultimately shut it down. A number of other communities in the country have actually succeeded in doing that, but so far DHS ICE has held on to the facility in Surprise, saying that they do want to go forward.
Yeah. Yeah, this new book that you have coming out, How to Close a Camp, obviously focuses on the detention centers and sort of the idea of the camp, which it sounds like, we're living in this current moment of escalation of detention and camps, but you talk about it as a really historic idea that's been theorized by a lot of different thinkers over time. Can you talk about that sort of deep history and the different ways that people have conceptualized what camps are?
Yeah, so yeah, I think there's a couple different ways you could trace the history of the immigration camp. One is starting in the United States in the 19th century, where we have something that looked more or less like a jail specific to immigrants who have committed no crime except having been in the so-called wrong place, having crossed a border without authorization. So those camps first arose in the late 19th century in Washington State and in New York State. And there was sort of like a slow expansion of them. The Supreme Court, in a series of cases in the 1880s, basically allowed them to continue and allowed for things like mandatory or at least long-term detention. And then there was like over half a century of something like stagnation, where there were some moments where there's a lot of people temporarily detained while they're deported, like during the Mexican Repatriation Act in the 1930s, during Operation Wetback in the 1950s. But there wasn't like a huge explosion or a huge increase in the number of camps until the 80s, 90s, and really this century. So that is one way you can trace the arc of the rise of the detention camp, or immigration camp. Another is going back and sort of broadening your view and trying to understand what is a concentration camp and why people were held there. And the logic, I think, is actually related, is holding people who are deemed unwanted or out of place or a impediment to whatever the state's goals are at the time. And so we saw this during especially the colonial era. The United States helped implement some early concentration camps in both Cuba and the Philippines in the very late 19th century. And then there's one other sort of way when you're started broadening this idea of what a camp is, to kind of look back even further, and you can go to the reservation system in the United States. And here, really, what the U.S. government was doing was deporting people within the confines of the United States at the time to a different place. And they were concentrating them and penning them in, even if there weren't necessarily walls that were built around them. And that logic extends back to very early days of the, conquest and colonization of the United States, when the first Spanish settlers in the Southwest were trying to control and limit and stop from moving some of the indigenous populations, even right here in this U.S., in southern Arizona.
Yeah. In the colonial context, like in the Philippines, what was sort of the ambition of having camps in those colonial contexts?
Well, it's as I said, like the logic really wasn't that different than what you are seeing today. There was this attempted implementation of forced or coerced agriculture in both of those places. There was this concern about dissidents as the US government was taking control of these islands, these island states. And they recognized that having a population that had agency and could move was a potential threat, both to the economy, because they couldn't be forced or coerced into work, and because they could be, political dissidents. And so they tried to control or corral these people into basically almost like cities, like built cities that were, again, not always necessarily ringed by like barbed wire or walls, but you were not allowed to leave. You needed to ask permission to leave. And so
Right.
the logics are really the same.
Yeah. And so then how do we get from sort of the mid 20th century where there is sort of this very small number of detention camps in the US, it's kind of fizzled out as a technology, to the situation we're in today, where I think you said when you were writing the book there were 220 in the United States?
That number is actually, no one's been really able to establish a exact count of how many detention camps are in the United States right now. Uh, you look at experts, you look at ICE itself, and the numbers are always varying. I mean, it's hard. They're hard to count for a number of different reasons, including sometimes jails rent out space, like a wing of the jail for immigration detention. Marshals facilities will rent out or re-outfit part of their facilities for immigration detention, and it's growing so fast. So like you count the number today, and tomorrow might be different, and sometimes they close too. But to go back to your question about how we've seen this ballooning sort of trend of immigration detention, you have to take into consideration the rise of mass incarceration writ large as well. So the trends sort of followed each other, or leapfrogged each other. Mass incarceration, you can trace it back to like the 1960s, the very early iterations of sort of the wars on drugs and wars on crime, but really it was in the 80s and 90s under Reagan and Clinton. And it's very important to just point out the bipartisan nature of both mass incarceration and mass immigration detention. So as the carceral, like the prison industrial complex started really picking up in that era, as these notions of threats of crime, especially against people of color, were really like bandied about in the news a lot and in politicians' mouths, you saw this enormous rise in mass incarceration. And this experiment that the American, state has been conducting for now decades is the largest form of incarceration we've seen in a long, long time. And especially outside of, and unprecedented outside of a current state of war. So you see this prison boom, and at the same time, and this coincides with increasing immigration for a number of different reasons, including changes in US law. In some ways, after 1965, it was easier for some people to migrate. And that was after a huge change in immigration law. And then, especially the rise in the 80s, Central America and Mexico, with increased migration from both of those places because of US policy. And from elsewhere in the world as well, just ongoing instability. You saw a huge increase in forced displacement. And instead of addressing those issues, the underlying issues of why people are forced from their homes, or welcoming them as they cross these imposed borders, the response from the United States, and this country has been leading the world in this, has been to lock up and try to send back migrants. And so you went from a few dozen immigration detention centers with relatively low populations in the 70s to the 80s and 90s, where you start to see dozens and dozens, and now we're into the hundreds. And I mentioned like the leapfrogging and the bipartisan nature of it. You saw both Clinton and Obama, the two past Democratic administrations, tried this game of sort of acquiescing to some of the right-wing conservative demands of cracking down on immigration and really setting the stage for their successors to come in, both Bush after Clinton, who in some ways in response to 9/11 and had a huge influx of money that Congress gave them to make the nation safe, supposedly, hugely expanded border enforcement, hugely expanded the number of people who were detained by Border Patrol and newly established ICE. And then Obama to Trump was the same thing. We saw the expansion of family detention. We saw the crackdown against through policies like secure communities, through interior enforcement, and all of that just really gave Trump a blueprint and an infrastructure to just expand it. One of the, I think, key ways of understanding what's happening under Trump too is that the innovation here is not really cruelty or a change in approach towards immigration enforcement. The innovation under Trump too, I think, is efficiency. Is they didn't have the money and they didn't have the concerted will under the first Trump administration to lock up as many people, to deport as many people, and to block from coming as many people as they're doing now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things also that's been sort of challenging for me to wrap my head around at times is that there are multiple moments in people's sort of immigration journeys at which they end up in detention, right? Like people who are making asylum claims have mandatory detention, and people who are awaiting deportation are also often in detention. So it's this sort of mixed group, I guess.
Yeah, it's so confusing and illogical. One of the things that just to point out how absurd the situation is right now, as of very recently, because of a Supreme Court decision a couple days ago, there's really no way to ask for asylum if you try to come into the United States right now, especially if you try to cross the U.S.-Mexico border. But previous to that, if you showed up at the border and were, waiting in line, doing it so-called the right way, you showed up at the border and you asked for asylum, you would be deemed a quote-unquote arriving alien and be subjected to mandatory detention. There's some possibility in the past of getting out on bond, but you're basically going to be detained. Whereas if you were able to sneak through the border in some way, stayed in the country for a while, and then asked for asylum from within the country, you were not subject to mandatory detention. There's a kind of incentivizing people to cross clandestinely, which was that the intent of the way that they wrote the laws? Not really. It's just so harebrained and wire-crossed, confusing, and so many different attempts have been made over the years to supposedly fix the problem that things like that resulted. We're just like, wait, this doesn't make any sense, and is just mean and cruel and sort of hypocritical to the supposed approach you're proffering.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's because within asylum you have these sort of multiple types of asylum, and I think that, I don't know, it seems to me like they didn't fully sort of consider the southern border as a place where people would, ask for asylum when they thought about asylum initially. They weren't, they just couldn't foresee what they were going to experience, I guess. But yeah. Within the sort of detention center network that exists in the United States now, can you talk about the balance of public and private detention centers and why there's been this rise in privately run detention centers?
Well, that's changing very rapidly too. And so as of late last year, about 90% of all migrants who are in detention camps were held in facilities that were privately run. But you see this expansion of federal, and then even an example of a state-run facility. So Alligator Alcatraz was owned and operated by the state of Florida. Of course, they had contractors, but it's really a state facility, which was unique. Also, East Camp, Montana, outside of El Paso, that's a completely federally run, not completely, but with some contractors, facility. So, and some of these warehouses too, some of them may be partially run, or parts of the operations would be contracted out, but really they'd be federal facilities. And that is a change compared to places like Eloy here in Arizona, which is owned and operated by CoreCivic. But yeah, so there's a couple different main players. Core Civic is one of them. Geo Group is another. Those are the two big ones. There's a few others. Management and Training Corporation, that's maybe of interest to local viewers because that is the owner of the potentially new facility in Marana, outside of Tucson. But yeah, so these are the huge players who have given so much money in lobbying to not only Republican administrations. They gave money to the Obama administration as well, but they've been really dishing it out. And there's this revolving door. You have Tom Homan, who is the border czar, who has worked for Geo in the past. You have a whole host of examples such as that, where the people who leave government, leave running or partially like having high positions in ICE or CBP, leave and go to these private groups and they know exactly what they need to do, who to call, and they get huge contracts. I mean, just multi-billion dollars, like Delaney Hall, which has been in the news recently, has a multi-billion dollar contract going to Geo Group. I mean, the sums are hard to fathom, and they're just raking it in right now. And so you have to think what the profit motive is as well. It's not just this ideological anti-immigrant xenophobia. It's also this is a cash cow. There's a lot of corporations who are really raking it in, and they have also the numbers of these politicians who are making the decisions like in their Rolodex. So the back and forth is disturbing. And what's also disturbing, and this is no surprise to anyone who's at all followed private you know incarceration, is if you think of it as a moneymaker, you're going to try to limit your expenses. And limiting expenses means paying your workers less, hiring less workers, skimping on food, skimping on medical care, all of the above. And what that does is that makes conditions inside these facilities dangerous, deadly. I mean, just a truly abysmal reality for people inside. I mean, this is something that we could spend a long time talking about, just what it's like inside these facilities. I was last night, before taping, I was at a rally outside of Eloy for a woman who has Yadi, who is a lesbian woman, longtime resident of Phoenix, who has been in for 16 months for what very much seems like a bogus reason why she was originally detained. She has leukemia. She's lost 70 pounds. She is coughing and vomiting up blood. She is not getting medical care that she needs, and she is suffering. And last night, they kept on, like, her supporters, her partner, kept on saying she's dying inside. They're killing her. So, she is slowly being murdered by the state because of a supposed civil infraction. And I can't stress enough how serious the conditions are, not only for her, but for anyone who goes inside.
Yeah. Do we know, or is there a sense of what the logic is between the logic of this shift from the private back to the publicly run facilities? Do they just have so much cash that they don't need to hire out profit motivated companies? Or
I think they have their foot on the gas, and they are looking for any and every way to increase detention capacity. Their goal, as stated earlier, rather late last year, was to go from a max capacity of around high 60,000 to 108,000. That is a huge increase, and that's a very fast increase. We hit an all-time high of immigration detention in February, I believe, of about 70,000 people. That was unprecedented, and it's dipped a little bit, but they're very much still trying to get those numbers up. And I think the statistics matter to them. You see Stephen Miller, White House counsel and longtime sort of Trump whisperer, really be concerned with how many people they were deporting and wanted to get quotas for ICE. Supposedly it was 3,000 people arrested a day, which they haven't been able to meet. And I think that is one of the driving forces of just open everything you can as quickly as you can. And some of that's going to look like federally owned facilities, and some of it's going to be contracted out and owned by private for-profit prison companies.
Right. I guess in this moment of just rapid expansion, it's easier for them to just buy the facilities and hire people themselves than to negotiate contracts with a contractor or something like that.
Well, the first part is definitely true. It's faster for them to buy these facilities, but to hire people themselves, that's actually been one of the sticking points. It's hard to find people who want to or can work in them. And I think that is one of the reasons that a lot of these places haven't opened sooner. It costs money to re-outfit them. The facility in Surprise that I already mentioned, that was built to be a warehouse of goods. And to sort of re-outfit it to hold people is complicated, but it's a doable task. But then hiring enough people, a few hundred guards and staff who are going to be working in really stressful, anxiety-inducing, trying circumstances, not be paid that well, and maybe be maligned or hated by the people that they are working amongst. Like, it's not really an attractive job prospect. And that's another thing that I look at pretty closely in this book too, is the toll not only on the people who are held inside, which, as we said, is as bad as you can imagine, but it really has negative effects on the people who work there and the communities that these places are located in as well. The rates of suicide, the rates of depression, the rates of like medical issues of people who work in these facilities are higher even than veterans. Like, it's really takes a toll on the individual person and their health, and their mental health, to have to go into these facilities and be, torturing people. I mean, that is just what it is. I mean, the expanded use of solitary confinement has skyrocketed in the past year. I mean, the number of people who are held for over 20 days, which the UN officially classifies as torture, is much, much higher than it used to be. And people held for even just a couple days it has profound and lasting effects. A held in solitary confinement has profound and lasting effects. And these guards are the ones who have to implement it, the following orders or whatever. But God, that takes a toll.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to ask you about the section of the book that's called The Cost of Dependency, about why these are not the sort of economic engines for a small community that doesn't have another economic driver that sometimes they're promised to be. What are the sort of downsides of deciding that a detention center is going to be sort of the economic salvation of your community, besides what you've just said, which are the ripple effects of the mental, health
Yeah.
effects?
Well, there's a number of ways that you can look at this. One, and there's been some creative studies who have looked at the number of uh, commercial businesses that have fled towns that have become prison towns. And you see the replacement of small town family owned businesses with big box stores or with national chains. And that is one clear effect. But you also see overall, you can look at like longitudinal studies and see that actually the number of businesses that ultimately close, goes up when a prison comes to town. You can also look at strains on local health services, on the hospitals. I mean, as I hope I've made clear, like, these places are not good for the health of both the people held inside and the people who work inside. And they rely on 911 services, they rely on local hospitals, and that isn't always fully reimbursed, or it's just a strain. I did some reporting in early days of COVID about these immigration camps being huge facilitators for the spread of COVID. And this is where they spread it not only to their local communities, but then these people were some of them were ultimately deported. And they spread it to countries that didn't have the resources to respond to COVID the way that the U.S. did. Not saying that the U.S. did a great job at it, but so just like the effects, like, really do ripple out far and wide. And though sometimes when there's not a clear other options, some towns can become reliant on them. And then they're understandably, like, the residents are understandably scared if one shuts down. Some of these places, or a lot of these places rather, are located in rural communities where there's not much else going on, especially with, the gutting of other sort of industries, whatever that may be. You see these towns where this is one of the sole sources of employment besides like basic, service restaurant jobs and things like that. And they're nervous about like, well, if this goes, then what's going to happen to all the jobs? And that's a fair concern, but there have been some really cool efforts to help communities think through, okay, what could we have instead? Because there are other options. There are places like Torrance, New Mexico is one place I look closely at in the book that doesn't have a hospital. The nearest real professional medical facility is over an hour away, and there's an aging community in this small rural New Mexico town that needs health services, and hospitals. A hospital could be a good replacement for the detention center that they're relying on. And reliability is another factor, just to throw one more piece in the mix, is that these places do open and close. These places are subject to a lot of machinations back in DC, including funding. And so, you might have you think you have some stability or you can rely on these facilities staying open for a while, but you just can't, because they will get shut down, and they do. And I think, especially right now, and this is such a volatile issue, and it's changing so fast, that to think that this is something that's going to be a lasting form of employment is just pretty short-sighted.
Yeah, that's a great point. They could just be decommissioned at any time.
And yeah, we have examples of that. I mean,
Yeah.
Irwin, which I did a ton of reporting on back in the day, a couple of years ago for Intercept, that place was shuttered. The prison side of it stayed open, but the immigration detention side of it shut down for a couple of years. It's now being reopened under the Trump administration, but that's sort of like neck snapping. Oh, you have jobs, you have a couple hundred extra jobs in your community, and then you don't, and then like a couple of years later you do again. Like people, like that is not a way that you can build a reliable, economic community just stability on, and you can't count on it.
Yeah. One of the really interesting points that you make in the book that I feel like is key, and especially hopefully key to the activists on the ground that will read it, is that shutting detention centers down or closing camps or stopping them from being built is really a matter of local activism more than federal activism in most cases. Can you talk about the different pressure points that communities have successfully used or maybe have not yet successfully exploited to stop camps from opening or shut them down?
Yeah, so I just did say that the people can pull strings in DC and open or close these things. For sure, that's part of the story. But another really important point, and this is something that a number of activist organizations have been working on for decades now, is that a lot of these facilities do depend on local infrastructure and local decision makers. So these places need to be permitted, they need to be licensed, they need to be accredited. They need people to work in them. They need to have the right like environmental reviews, and that all and more depends on state, county, and often municipal legislators or policymakers or politicians, stamping okay, signing a form, uh, you know, issuing a permit, and those people and those processes can be and are targeted. And there's a number of detention centers that have been successfully shut down because of that, because of broad rising political will to go to your local county municipal meetings, tell people that they don't want this here, see about passing a state law that could potentially outlaw. We have a number of states who have done that. Some of them have, been rescinded or faced pressures in court. But Illinois is one place where immigration detention, private immigration detention, is outlawed. California has tried to do the same, and ICE has been able to sort of skirt around it in different ways. But I think California and Chicago have severely limited the presence of ongoing immigration detention in those states. And there's a couple other states who have done and partially succeeded in the same. So it's not just like you have to beat Trump or you have to somehow, block Stephen Miller from affecting his agenda. You actually can go to your local county meeting and really try to pull on those strings, and that can be effective. One of the things I think I try to make the point of in the book is that these places staying open relies on political will, and that can change. And besides all the, local electeds that I've mentioned, people who work there, like these places can't run unless they are staffed. These places can't run unless they get water and electricity. All of those and many more are potential pressure points. If you can build a campaign around stopping at the local level, around letting people know what this will mean at the local level, then you can really limit, at least, and maybe even eliminate how many people are going to be detained in your community.
Yeah, with the news about the detention center warehouses and in the news recently, the sort of like sell off of some of them, one of them that's in Texas near El Paso. I remember reading in the Eastwind
Yeah.
site in Socorro, the city council of this really small town, Socorro, had passed two sort of resolutions. One, that they would not allow emergency services for detention centers, which is key. I mean, it's a thing that maybe they had never thought of passing a resolution before because it had never been on the table, but it's a thing that they could do. Just say like, no, like firemen are not going to go to detention centers, and that help stop a detention center in its track. And similarly, I think that they tried to sort of support the local water authority in not providing water, which of course was another key kind of like limiting factor for these
Yep.
mass kind of conversions. The surprise resolution that you mentioned is fascinating. What else have you seen in surprise?
Well, there's been a lot of pushback even among youth because there is a high school and a middle school about a mile from this facility. There is a cheer academy in the same sort of warehouse complex where
Well,
kids as young as 3 years old go to practice, becoming cheer people. And there's just been like widespread rejection of this. The number of people, I went to a couple of different city meetings there. The number of people who stand up in support are one or two, and then hundreds upon hundreds. So I think at the first meeting after this was announced, there's over 1,000 people who came out to try to push back. You mentioned Socorro passing a resolution to not offer emergency services. That happened successfully also in Florida about 15 years ago. In Social Circle, Georgia, right now, this is like MAGA country. This is diehard, bright red, Trump-loving conservative Georgia. They have been saying, like, look, we just don't have the water for it, and we can't get the water for it. So what are we going to do here? And like they're currently in a fight, but a number of like Republican officials have actually called in favors to the Trump administration, saying like, look, supposedly we're for mass detention and mass deportation, but we just don't want to hear. And I think another thing that following closely a lot of campaigns to try to push back against detention, one of the things that I saw was that people will rally around any pushback at all. And if it's NIMBYism, if it's conservative based NIMBYism, people say, I'm for Trump, I'm for mass deportation, but I don't want this thing next to my school. They'll lean into that and they'll say, okay, let's work together and let's shut this down. And I think that any sort of sand in the gears, any sort of slowdown, people count as at least a partial success right now. But, slowing them down, if they only hit 80,000 people detained, if maybe they even don't increase detention at all, I think a lot of the activists that I spoke with also recognize that that's not enough. And you need to set your sights beyond this coming election, the next election. You need to set your sights on actual abolition or the ultimate end of the immigration enforcement regime. And that is going to take more than just these, very hyper local sort of procedural fights. That's going to take winning the argument. And that is a much more difficult, longer project to talk about the principle of what the freedom of movement would be. And, you have to try to balance. I mean, I think that one of the big challenges right now is balancing both pushback, immediate emergency response. I mean, they're rolling out basically the tanks in Minneapolis, as we saw earlier this year, and you need to support your neighbors, you need to stop people from getting killed, but you also have to set your sights on, like, not only do we want this to end, but we won't count it as a win when they just scale back a little bit, because that's what's happened. And I think another key point for people to take into mind here is that, this is a statistic that surprised me, is that even during the height of Metro Surge, which is the rollout operation in the Twin Cities, there were a number of other major metropolitan areas in the United States that saw more arrests, more immigration arrests than in the Twin Cities. And so you do not need that spectacle of violence. That actually is not a key component of affecting mass detention and deportation. And the reason I focus on detention in the book is that I think detention is actually one of the linchpins of the immigration enforcement regime and mass deportation. You can't affect the deportations. You can't roll out this agenda of anti-immigrant, hate unless you have the facilities to detain these people, unless you have the camps.
Right.
So
You can't arrest someone and just deport them straight away. It's routed through detention for
Yep.
various reasons.
Yep.
And so it is a key. Yeah, that's interesting. Where in that Metro Surge example is really interesting, that there were more arrests happening in other cities. Where are the majority of the arrests happening? Where are people
Well,
getting arrested?
at that point in time, if my memory serves, I think it was San Antonio, Atlanta, and there's a couple other cities that saw more arrests. But you can, and unfortunately the data is hard to come by, and they're trying to limit how easily we can understand where they're doing these operations. But well, I guess they're not so much doing these operations anymore. They're just being more efficient, and they're just catching people at courthouses still. They're putting people into deportation proceedings from USCIS, which is the agency that was supposedly created to bestow benefits to people. So they're catching them in all these different places, but they're not doing these staged deployments that we saw earlier. And so the arrests are happening everywhere. So there isn't as much of a concentration. LA, Chicago, the Twin Cities that we saw last year and earlier this year is now just, you are liable to be picked up anywhere. And again, going back to Tom Homan, shortly after Trump was elected and reelected in 2024, that was one of the first things he said. He said, if you are an immigrant, you need to be looking over your shoulder. And that's a really bleak way to, just a bleak mindset to foist upon millions of people. And it seemed, this nightmare scenario, but it's true. And that is the reality right now. People can be picked up and will be picked up almost anywhere. And one of the other ways that they do that is through like the complicity of local law enforcement.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I think we should probably wrap up, but I wanted to ask you as kind of a closing question. How are you going to try and get this book into the hands of people that can shut down camps in their own communities? And what do you hope that they do with the book once it is in their hands?
Yeah, well, this book in many ways is actually how-to. That's not just like a cheeky title. I mean, I include a number of appendices that explain how to do public records requests, that explain the questions you need to ask to understand who locally has any power at all to stop or limit the detention capacity. And so I think, thinking about this book as an actual manual, as a how-to, was important for me as I was writing it, and I hope it actually serves not only to inspire people or whatever to like hate what's happening right now, but then actually to take concrete steps to change it. And so how they can get it, where books are sold as of pretty soon. It comes out on July 21. I'm going to be doing a number of events in Tucson and Phoenix. You can follow me on my Substack, which I should put in show notes or whatever. And I'll list all the ways to purchase and where I'm going to be doing events and things. But also I also want to mention like the importance of local journalism and following Border Chronicle who highlight these and many other related issues. I think is really key. And also Lookout, where I work. We are really trying to keep a very close eye on local politics so that people can have the information to take action. And so following Border Chronicle and Lookout and amongst other great, local outlets, I think is also a really key step.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Thank you so much for your time. It was really fascinating talking with you as always. And I look forward to the reception of this book. I think it will have an important impact.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
That does it for this episode. That was John Washington discussing his new book, How to Close a Camp. This episode was edited by Jose Olivares. If you liked what you hear, please rate us on whichever platform you use to listen to your podcast because it helps other people find us. You can also subscribe to The Border Chronicle at theborderchronicle.com or support us with a paid subscription. Thanks. See you next time.
You've always taken such charge.
Llegó justo antes del aguacero.
You are listening
to The Border Chronicle.